Good morning, colleagues. It's, according to my watch, past quarter past, and it's my privilege to introduce to you Professor Andrew Argent. He is the current head of pediatrics at UCT, Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital, where he works specifically in pediatric intensive care. He has years of experience in the field, has published widely, has been recognized by all his peers nationally and internationally as a expert in his field, and is going to be talking to us about research and perhaps tell us a little bit more about risk than we'd like to think we know. Andy, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lincoln, and thank you for those kind words, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. Some 30-odd years ago, I gave my first presentation as a registrar at the University of Pretoria, and I had to do it in Afrikaans. So I'm still traumatized by the experience, so forgive me for not speaking Afrikaans today. But to give some background to this talk, my practice has been in the area of clinical practice, predominantly, particularly in pediatric critical care, but I have worked in research, some of that in the laboratories, but mostly in the clinical context. And I've also had a link with an organization called Risky Business. So that's the hospital where I work in the context of the ICU, where we're privileged to have a lot of very high-tech equipment. This is something of the story of Risky Business. Please don't just Google Risky Business. You might get some things that you don't want. But if you Google Risky Business and Talks, the place that you'll get to is an organization that some years ago set out to gather together people from all sorts of spheres outside of medicine, but who had in common the fact that their business was high risk, that they had to maintain high standards all the time, and that things often went wrong. And how could we learn from those people and bring that business of human performance, developing teams and leadership into our practice in medicine? And if you actually go to the site, you'll find that they recorded talks from a wide range of people, including astronauts, actors, top sports people, people in the military, people in all kinds of disciplines. And it's been amazing, as you listen to those speakers, to realize the commonality that we have and the opportunity that we have in medicine generally to learn from those people and take those skills. But I'd like to suggest to you today that we have some of those issues in the business of research, and we might think of putting them there. So why do I say that? Well, first of all, in the world of clinical medicine, there are unfortunately multiple points at which things can and do go wrong. If you go to the US today and look at the major causes of death, hospital or medical related adverse events are responsible for about a third, or they're third in the hierarchy of risks. So we cause in medicine more deaths than a whole lot of the other things that we would normally blame. But I also want to suggest to you that research, and particularly clinical research, has high intrinsic risks. I'll show you some data showing that actually a lot of what is published is wrong, and we need to think about what in our research process actually allows that to happen. So here's some data from Chan et al. That was published some years ago, and they simply asked the question of research studies at different levels. These are national levels, these are different sample sizes, these are different phases of study, and these are different groups ranging from non-government, government, industry, and all trials. What you can see here is that studies where studies were known to be performed, overall, about 45% of them are actually published. So what happens to all that data? What happens to all that effort that has just disappeared? Here's another article that has this alarming headline of why most published research data are false. And some of the issues they point out, which are entirely valid, are first that many of the studies are too small, that many of the effects that are measured are very small, so the impact is tiny. We know that if you look at many studies, what they've done is they've compared multiple parameters. And what you know is the more things you look at, the more likely are you to find something that reaches statistical significance that probably isn't significant at all. The more people say, oh, well, I'll gather the data and then crunch it as best I can, and the more flexibility there is in the study design, the more likely it is to be wrong. Sadly, the greater the financial and other interests that there are, the more likely the research results are going to be false. And the more scientific teams that are involved, the more likely they are to be false as well. But it's not only those sorts of things which are kinds of errors in trial design. We know that the kind of gold standard in clinical medicine now is the randomized control study. And if that's done really well, that gives you real data. So here's some data looking at the whole field of ARDS, where they reviewed some 159 published randomized trials. And what we're seeing is that in randomized trials, you're getting, out of 159 studies, a clinically significant benefit in 8, and 2 of them actually showed an adverse effect. Now, how does that happen? I mean, a randomized control study, has been carefully designed to study something that you're pretty sure has an impact. And we're getting 7 out of 159 actually have clinical impact. That's a vast amount of effort, money, that has just disappeared. So what are we doing? Here's a commentary that comes from Brian Cavanagh and Laffey that was published a little earlier this year. And if you look in the area of critical care, and you look at randomized control studies, about 5% of those studies come out with reliably positive tests. Well, that's crazy. Probably what underlies a lot of that is that we are lumping too many patients with too many conditions into one lump. I think we've discovered that in fields like asthma, where we've said asthma, and you look at a whole range of therapies, well, if asthma is more than one condition, if there are multiple pathogeneses in asthma, that might explain it. That's certainly true about sepsis studies. It's probably true about ARDS. So now, what we know is that many studies never happen. Many are never completed. Well over half are never published. Many of those are not true. And many of the big ones that are published were poorly designed in the first place. And I haven't even started to talk about the issues of fraud in medicine. And what we know is that there have been some very significant frauds, some closer to home in South Africa in oncology, but others in areas such as the use of fluid resuscitation. How does this happen? I mean, people in medicine are generally honest folk who are out to do their best. No one's really out to do things badly. So let's think a little bit about it. And I think part of it is that actually, if you venture into research, if you knew the outcome, you wouldn't have to do the research. So you're already going into the unknown, and that carries some risk. And there are different issues about research. Atul Gawande has spoken about various problems being defined as simple. That's where it's straightforward. There's a cause and effect. In the clinical thing, it's like hand washing. We know it works, but we don't do it very well. Then there's complicated, where there may actually be multiple steps in the process. If it's complicated, we can still get our heads around it, and we know that if we do those steps in the right sequence, we'll get what we want at the end. And quite a lot of research is complicated. If you look at all the processes that actually have to go through before you complete a study, you realize that it's got multiple steps and there's a complication in making sure you go through all those steps. And then there's the issue of complexity. Now, complexity is like bringing up children. What you do with one does not necessarily work with the other, as many people will know. And what it is that if you make a change, the consequence of that change may not be what you expect, and it may be completely unexpected. And we have to admit that in the area of research, some of them fit into that. But I also want to suggest to you that there's some aspects of research that are completely counterintuitive. The reason I put this up is if any of you have ever been in a kayak approaching a rock, you know that the intuitive thing to do is to lean away from the rock. That is completely catastrophic because what will happen is the water will catch the upper end of the boat and you are sunk straight away. But there's quite a lot of research that is actually counterintuitive. If you don't believe me, let's talk about some of the human factors. So, first of all, I want to just raise the issue of selective attention. I'm going to go on to some of the issues of how people think, and then some of the things of interruption. If you want to, you can go and find this video on the internet. And what this video is, it's a video of a bunch of people passing basketballs to each other. There's a white team, or a team in white, and a team in black. And the thing that we ask participants to do is to watch the video and count how many times the participants pass the ball to each other. And during the course of that video, that gorilla walks through the field. On average, 50% of the audience simply do not see the gorilla. Because if you focused on one thing, what happens is you don't see the other thing. So there are many things that happen in research that are happening in front of our eyes, but we don't necessarily see them. This is a picture of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who worked together talking about how humans think about things and how humans make mistakes. What they showed is that humans are lousy statisticians. I was fascinated by the data earlier showing what risk and how did people perceive risk. Well, in general, even people with a training in statistics, intuitive response to a risk is that we're completely wrong. If you look at things like how long do you think it'll take to complete a task, we are all of us hopelessly over-optimistic in the time taken to complete it, but we're also hopelessly pessimistic about the time on what can be achieved over a year or two. So there are many things that we perceive wrongly. And in fact, depending on how I put the risk to you, whether I put it as you have a risk of a positive effect or a risk of a negative effect, you will get it wrong. Kahneman also spoke about thinking fast and thinking slow. What we all do is we have to make rapid assessments of the people we meet. That's part of life. There are lots of decisions we have to make where you take an impression, make a decision, get on with it. There are lots of things that we do in clinical medicine and in research where we look at something, we get the answer, and it's wrong. You actually have to go back and think through the logic. If you don't believe me, I'm sure most of you are mathematically literate, so just do the sum for me. A bat and a ball together cost 110 Rand. The bat costs 100 Rand more than the ball. What's the cost of the bat? Okay, so how many said 100 Rand? Just put up your hands on average. Wonderful. I'm sorry, but the answer is not 100 Rand. Although that feels like intuitively every time. And we keep making mistakes like that. I hate to tell the women in the audience, but multitasking is actually a myth. None of us can actually do that. And what we do is we do one thing at a time, but we break steps. And I'll tell you in a moment the consequence of doing that. On average, the most we can remember at any one time is about 7 things. And that's on a good day when you're not tired, where you don't have an emotional load and no one's interrupting you. But think of the research processes that we go through and the multiplicity of things that are coming at you and how easy it is to get distracted. And so the reality of who we are is that all of us, even researchers, make mistakes. It's made worse by some of these things. I'll speak a little bit later about fatigue and not just decision fatigue. Emotional loading is actually a massive issue. And we just have to learn to deal with the fact that every single one of us, will and does make mistakes. That means that if we're going to have reliable research results that come out, we have to find ways of putting systems together that pick up mistakes. The airlines are extraordinary. On average, the airlines know that there are about 100 million mistakes that happen in the cockpit on commercial airlines every single year. That translates into about 25 accidents because they have put in systems that are so tight at picking up errors, picking up things, cross-checking, having systems that work, and perhaps we should learn from them. And I just need to keep picking up on this emotional thing. Medicine in general does not have a good history of how we treat each other and how we're polite to each other, particularly in some of the more autocratic societies. What we have to know is that emotion affects us. Even if it wasn't directed at us, even if we see it happening around it, that affects what we are. We're also affected by what's been said about us. There's amazing data from the US that if you ask college students before they write an exam to register their gender on the piece of paper that they store on, women will on average do about 5% worse in the maths test because they've been told that girls don't do maths that well. That's just having to write their gender on it. So what has been said about us, what is perceived about us, and what is perceived about who we are has massive implications. And that is an issue in this country with our racial history and everything that goes with that. And then you put us to research in environments like this, which is a standard ICU, but it's no more complex than the research environments with multiple patient issues, multiple factors coming into that zone. But what about interruptions? So here's just a little bit of data, and I want you to focus on the time that actually happens if you have interruptions in a task. And what you can see is that if you have one interruption, if you have no interruptions, it's one fragment, it takes you a certain amount of time. If you have one interruption, it takes you twice as long. If you have 2 interruptions, it takes you much longer, and so on. And with each interruption, the probability that you will make a mistake goes up very substantially. So how many of you researchers in this room actually complete tasks without being interrupted? Without people coming into the room, without you being asked things, and that's particularly true about the environment. And again, just to highlight that actually overt aggression, emotional, disrespectful speech and behavior can affect it. And we all know the stories of the heads of departments, the directors, who are rude and abrupt to people. Unfortunately, it affects the quality of what's done. And of course, when you look at risk, one of the ways of looking at this, and this is a way that's often used in the aviation, is that you have attention. You have resources available for a task. You have the workload that needs to be done, and you have the risks of something going wrong. And so in an ideal world, when you've got lots of money, there isn't too much work to be done. The risk is well away from where we're actually operating, and there's very little chance of risk. But then what happens is times get tight, so there's a little bit more tightness on the finances, there's not much left. And then actually the patient load goes up, or actually you've taken on 2 more studies and it just needs to go through. And what now happens is these people, the managers, are telling the people doing the work that, well, guys, you've got to do more with less. Ever heard that statement? And then what happens is this risk thing starts drifting closer and closer into the area where we operate. And that's where things go wrong. You cannot run research on a shoestring, because if you start cutting corners, you start getting mistakes. Now, intriguingly, there are organizations like people who do crazy things like flying jet airplanes onto aircraft carriers under unbelievable conditions, carrying big loads of fuel, weaponry, and things that are likely to cause harm. And they operate so tightly that although they're so close to the margins, they get away with it. Unfortunately, most medical research and most medical practice is so poorly defined that even if we're quite away from the edge, we often will get it wrong. So I've spoken about the risks and the nature of what we do, but again, if we don't look after our staff and treat people well, things will continue to go wrong. One of the things I have to do as part of my job is to do performance evaluations on people. And it actually strikes me that in research and in clinical medicine, we do things all the time that are dangerous. We keep over-rewarding what we can call overperformance. You know what, if you want to be professor, well, have 200 publications. Well, you know, that puts in a whole risk and pressure of getting the papers out there, even if they're not quite accurate, and perhaps, you know, getting a couple of your students to put something out and put your name on it. And we create that situation. One of the people I know who was involved in fraudulent research was someone who was a senior around when I was a junior. And I could never understand it. I thought, this guy, he had the top reputation. He actually had all the kudos. He was head of a department. He had a major unit. What possessed him to do the fraudulent stuff? But you know, the problem is if you run a big unit, you've got to get the grants out there. And you've got to get the grants coming in every year. And if you don't get the research out, well, the grants don't come and things don't happen. And there's this expectation that you will be churning out the stuff. And we, just in our structures, have never provided graceful ways of saying to people, here's a way of backing out, here's a way of taking over. So we need to think about the system that we do that creates these problems. We need to think about the structure of how we do it. One thing the airline industry has discovered is that you have to involve the entire crew. On an aircraft, the captain has complete authority, absolute authority on that flight. But what they've discovered is if you don't train the captain to learn to listen to everyone else, and if you don't train all the staff on the aircraft to be able to be assertive without being aggressive, to be able to speak up when they see something going wrong, you have catastrophes. So how easy is it in our systems for junior researchers to say, hang on guys, something's wrong? How easy it is for our senior researchers to say, whoops, that was wrong, let's back off and change it. One of the things in medicine, but I think it's true in research as well, is that we tend to focus on when things go wrong. We often do the M&Ms, we look at it, and we analyze what went wrong. But there's a wonderful book that you can find out there entitled the power of positive deviance, which is where they went to the people who got it right despite all the odds and chose to learn from them. And perhaps that's something we can learn about in research. Anyone who's got to the end of their study and have thought, well, I've done the hard work, I should be able to just get this thing finished, knows that writing is not necessarily easy. And again, one of the things we need to be looking at is how we create structures that enable people to learn writing skills. And there's some remarkable work that comes out of the US where providing protected writing spaces that were in a collegial environment had a massive response in terms of output and papers. One of the comments about the research industry and medicine in general is that for many years we've run it as a bit of a cottage industry. We've trained as researchers, we've trained as clinicians, but very few of us are trained in managing big projects, significant budgets, setting deadlines, making sure that we use resources efficiently, and we really need to be looking at the lessons from industry on process improvement. You might also be interested in some of the talks that we've had at Risky Business from people like Richard Koch, the conductor. And one of the things that Richard pointed out to us was that we often focus on the conductor, and we talk a lot about leadership skills and how to learn and go that way. But what about the followers? And actually, if you play an instrument in an orchestra, you have to be a highly skilled professional. And if you choose not to work exactly in that orchestra, you can devastate the function of that. So how many of us are trained as good followers, learning how we actually fit into a team and actually make it work? What about some of the other things? I'll speak more about sleep improvisation, but how good are we at processes of handover from this team to that team, from this data capture to that data capture? Those are systems. But as individuals, what are the things that we can do to produce some resilience? And this is Ashok Sarniak, he's an interesting chap. He started out in India. He had a foreign body and was developing bronchiectasis when a visiting surgeon took that lobe out for him. And he ended up as an intensivist in the US. And when he retired, he spoke about cultivating a sense of gratefulness and a sense that it's a community that has actually supported us, and perhaps we can learn from that. All these issues that are on that slide are things that all of us need to be looking at to help develop the resilience that enables us to work in challenging environments. Wayne Derman spoke to us at one of the meetings about his work with the Paralympians. All of them, people who in their lives had had major loss of functionality or of their dreams. It's intriguing, his comment here that the key to resilience is indeed humor, the most important component of emotional intelligence. Another sports psychologist suggested some questions that those of us working in research or clinical medicine should perhaps be asking ourselves. And that's relevant because if you look at the data on how many people in clinical research in medicine are actually burnt out and are struggling with their careers, in disciplines such as critical care, that number is between 50 and 70% of people in the field. Perhaps we need to learn from those. And then, interestingly, again at one of the Risky Business meetings, the issue of sleep. If you really want an intriguing read as to what we do to ourselves when we limit our sleep, you'll find that, for instance, if you've been working for 16 hours without a break, your performance is equivalent to someone who is too drunk to be allowed to drive a car. If you've been working for 24 hours, your performance is absolutely abysmal. If you regularly are sleep deprived at any level, your performance in multiple spheres drops off catastrophically. And yet one of the biggest epidemics in modern life is lack of sleep. And for all of us in clinical medicine, sleep and interrupted sleep is a major problem. One wonders what that does to our research. So I just want to leave you with some messages that if we want to provide safe, effective, good quality research, we need to understand the nature of being human and when we will perform badly, why we will perform badly, and why we need systems that actually pick up our problems. We need to learn from others, and there are many disciplines outside of medicine and healthcare that have got a lot to teach us. A hefty dose of both humility and humor will go a long way. And oh, by the way, let's get enough sleep. So thank you very much for your attention.